Hello, I'm Stephen Buckley, and we're in a series walking through the grand narrative of the Bible, building a biblical framework and hopefully having some fun doing so. Today we are tackling the creation account, the first 7 days of the beginning of time. We're going to move through the account one day at a time, so have your Bible ready. It's a good idea to read chapter 1 and the first 3 verses of chapter 2 beforehand if possible. We're going to be patient with the text, and looking at my notes, this could exceed 2 hours, so you can pause it if you like and divide it into say 2 episodes and watch day 4 till the end another time, or you can just plow through it with me, whatever works for you. And before we dive into the text, let's remind ourselves of the context in which the creation account sits, the Torah. We begin with Genesis, the first of the 5 books of Moses, referred to as the Pentateuch or Torah, Hebrew for teaching, and in biblical context, instruction or law. The Torah is the first of 3 groupings that constitute the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, called the Tanakh, an acronym for Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, the Ketuvim, the writings, which includes everything else. These 5 books were written throughout the time in the wilderness in the Middle East, between the world they left behind in Egypt and entering the promised land, approximately 1400 BC. It's astonishing to think that these handful of books that began the Bible, which founded much of Western thought, was written around 3,500 years ago. Each book of the Pentateuch is called by the opening word or phrase that began the scroll that it was written on. Genesis is called Bereshit, in the beginning. It was originally called Sefer Maseh Bereshit, the book of the act of in the beginning. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in 250 BC, they called it Genesis, Genesios, meaning origins or beginnings. It was titled the Book of Origins, although the Greek for Genesis was a translation from the Hebrew word toldot, which is frequently translated as generations. Genesis reads like a story, beginning with creation, the Garden of Eden, and ending with the death and the burial of Joseph. Eden, Babel, Noah's Ark, Abraham, they are known the world over. And it's not because it's a book of heroes. It is incredibly honest about the depravity of man, shortcomings of leadership, family tensions, jealousy, sibling rivalry, deception, fertility, despair, heartbreak. It's a psychological eye-opener that sets the tone for the rest of the Bible. Ancient national texts would omit negative connotations to paint the rulers, the culture, the lifestyle in bright light, and thus the ruthless honesty of Torah lends it credibility. Genesis answers the questions of life. How did we get here? Why do we die? What is the purpose of living? Why do we wear clothes? Why is there suffering? Why are there many nations with many languages, and so forth? Genesis tells us what went wrong and the foundational message of how it can be set right. Consider that as a percentage of history, from creation to cross, Genesis covers 60%. 60%. From creation until the present day, all of history, Genesis covers 40%. Over 2,300 years of history. The remaining books of Torah cover around 120 years between them. Genesis provides the cosmic context of the patriarchs. It is the foundational book of the foundational unit, which is why all major New Testament writers refer to the book of Genesis. It is referred to throughout Scripture more than any other book. Over 200 quotations or references are in the New Testament. Jesus and the apostles refer to the people and the events of Genesis as real people and real history. It is a book of history. It was originally ordered after the prologue with a heading, The History of Heaven and Earth, followed by 10 headings, the family history of Adam, the family history of Noah, down to the family history of Jacob. Each heading describes what became of the creation or person. The family history of Terah focuses on what became of him, namely Abraham. The family history of Isaac mainly concerns Jacob. The family history of Jacob concerns the 12 tribes and in particular Joseph and so on. The narrative begins with universal scope and it narrows its focus to an individual who is a type of Messiah. As well as family division, it can be viewed as a two-division structure. Genesis 1:1 to 11:9, the origin of world and nations, with 4 major events: creation, fall, flood, and nations. And then Genesis 11:10 to the end, 50:26, the origin of the people of Israel, with 4 significant people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Some divide the narrative into 3 major origins that narrow in focus. Chapter 1, the origin of the world, 2 to 11, the origin of the nations, and chapters 12 to 50 is the origin of Israel. Genesis truly is a book of origins. It records the origins of the universe, life forms, man, marriage, clothing, occupation, purpose, sin, death, language, nations, culture, government, religion, covenant, Sabbath, blood sacrifice, salvation, prophecy, peace, war, election, faith, grace, mercy, judgment, music, and so much more. It can be helpful to describe the form of Genesis in this way. Chapters 1 to 2 is defined as good. Chapters 3 to 11 is the cause and effect of sin and God's mercy throughout judgment. 12 is the critical juncture with the call of Abraham, and from there on out it describes God's dealing with him and his descendants. And up to 36 we are faced with the distinction between Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, from Lot, Ishmael, and Esau, respectively, God binding his reputation to the former. Who do we identify with, it asks. Chapters 37 to 50, the story of Joseph, who is distinct from them all. There is an overall theme of blessings and curses, climaxing in a right relationship with the seed of Abraham that will bring blessing, but a wrong one will result in cursing. Its purpose is about the sovereign creator of all, the covenant-keeping God of Israel, the historical and theological basis of Israel as the chosen people. The Son of God appears as the Lord walking in the garden, as the promise of salvation in Genesis 3:15, and as the angel of God, and as typology through figures such as Adam and Melchizedek. I will quickly touch on the remaining books of the Torah. Exodus, called by the first words on the scroll, these are the names. Exodus begins with a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, the deliverance of and the raising up of Moses, and speedily into the demonstration of God's mighty power through national deliverance from slavery, the sea crossing, the creation of Israel as a nation at Sinai, to the Lord descending upon the newly constructed tabernacle in the wilderness. Robert Alter describes Exodus as a national epic. The pressure of events shape the people, which forms identity and purpose. Yet they still required a collection of instructions covering all of life that form an institution. The first words on the third scroll we call Leviticus are, "and he called." The 27 chapters consists of Israel's laws regarding offerings, sacrifices, and the festivals. Leviticus is the centerpiece of the Torah, if you like, that includes blood atonement. I remember Pawson would show how Genesis and Deuteronomy are kind of like bookends of the Torah, which had universal implications. And then you have Exodus and Numbers either side with a national aspect, and then Leviticus, the kind of tribal focus. So it narrows in from universal down to tribal in the center. The book of Numbers, the fourth scroll, begins in the wilderness, which is appropriate as it covers the 40 years the Israelites journeyed in the wilderness towards the promised land. It contains a census of the people of Israel, which is why we call it Numbers. Further laws, the grumbling against leadership, hostile peoples, hopes and disappointments, judgment and prophecy, the oracles of Balaam. These are the words Deuteronomy begins. The name Deuteronomy is from two Greek words meaning second law. Not that it was a second law, but it was a second giving of the law. Deuteronomy is a recapitulation of themes of the grand story of Torah, giving more weight to the three previous books as an apt conclusion. Those born in the wilderness, they wouldn't have experienced all of the journey. So looking over the Jordan before his departure, Moses addressed the people of Israel with the message of this book that will impact the hearts and minds of the younger generation who will enter the land. It also describes the transition of national and priestly leadership. Deuteronomy contains a striking list of blessings and curses in the final chapters. The 5 books of Moses should be considered as one, a compound one. Now, those who say Moses couldn't have possibly have written all of the Torah focus on 2 reasons. Firstly, the history of Genesis, which includes the creation through to Joseph's death, ends hundreds of years before his birth. Secondly, Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses. So, look, this is easily explained. In that period, documents of family generations were important, and they were passed down. God will have preserved the history through oral tradition and possibly pictorial writing, adding to Moses' extreme clarity of thought. As students of scriptures who believe in a divine inspiration, we learn that he made known his ways to Moses, his acts to the people of Israel. It says in Psalm 103. He proclaims what the Lord had commanded in Deuteronomy 1:3. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend, Exodus 33:11. It's possible that Moses compiled as master editor the bulk of Genesis, but equally God could have dictated the creation account and prophecy of his own death. The prophets often used past tense, what we call the prophetic perfect, a literary technique to signify the certainty of future events. Plus, Jesus and the biblical authors said Moses wrote it. So that settles it for me. Alter says these 5 books are chiefly an account of the origins and definition of the nation from its first forebearers who accepted a covenant with God to the moment when the people stands on the brink of entering the promised land. Israel is central to the narrative, beginning with the foundational books, the election of the patriarchs and the exodus of a people unto the formation of a nation. With that said, let's open the first scroll. In the beginning. Day 1. The story of history begins with 7 ancient Hebrew words. In English, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God, who existed eternally from everlasting to everlasting, spoke the universe into existence. The English word universe is testament to those first 7 synoptic words. Uni meaning one or single, together with the word verse meaning a spoken sentence, a single spoken sentence. God's word is plenty powerful to create the universe. By implication, God creates out of nothing by his word, God speaking into existence, is prophetic of the momentary future, with power to make it happen immediately. It tells us that he's a God who both speaks and acts. He speaks and it is done. He calls into existence the things that do not exist. I thoroughly enjoy learning from books, but there is power in the spoken word. Indeed, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of Scripture. Accompanying the spoken word of God the Father, Isaiah would later reveal that God declared it was my hands too. Whose hands? God the Son, pre-incarnate Jesus, who according to John was equally involved in creation, saying, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Paul agreed, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth. Verse 1 to verse 2 moves speedily from God's cosmic view to the surface level of the earth, the focus of his creation. The mighty spirit, the ruach of God alongside, hovering over the face of the waters, poised in power to help and sustain. In the beginning, time, past, present, future, the one God, Father, Son, and Spirit, created the heavens, space, height, width, depth, and the earth, matter, solid, liquid, gas, which came into existence simultaneously. The triune God conceived the Trinity of Trinities of existence in ways that we cannot fathom, but in a way that he wishes to express them in plain terms. The universe then had a beginning. Contrasting Mesopotamian creation stories written prior to the account of Moses, the God of the Bible has no beginning. While science struggles with answering how non-life can arise from nothing and how life came from non-life, Genesis 1 answers with a creator. God is the first cause. This declares that life has meaning. A creator creates for purpose. Without a creator God, there is no meaning. Life on earth is not down to random chance. Genesis provides the necessary need-to-know breakdown of the 6 days in which he created, the order of which is to teach us his ways, plans, and the very essence of who he is. Now, too often do I hear the false dichotomy that the creation story is about the who or the why, not the how. Well, if this is true, why is he awfully specific about how he created it? The how is tremendously important. If you miss it, you miss the character he's portraying of himself and the roadmap of the grand narrative ahead. The authorial intention was theological and historical. Who, why, how, and so what? If you study commentaries on Genesis 1 with any sort of depth, it will not be long before you come across Mesopotamian mythology that I just alluded to. This ancient literature includes Assyrian, Babylonian, and Sumerian creation epics such as the Astrahasis and the Enuma Elish. They supplied religious and political backbone to societies, describing mythical gods and elevating heroic people to legendary status. Pagan epics portray gods within the forces of nature. From the first verse, the Bible distinguishes God as pre-existent creator of nature, leaving, as Asana puts it, no room for magic in the religion of the Bible. When God speaks, he's not performing magic, which, like the pagan worldview, is a kind of nature God manipulating nature through voice, but a God independent of nature that is subject to his every breath. Those who foolishly succumb to the seduction of dark magic call upon demons to manipulate nature. They fail to recognize that they themselves are being manipulated by the evil one. All of this remains within a closed system. Creation calling upon creation to manipulate creation, to impress creation. The Bible pulls away from this idolatry of magic and points to the self-existent creator God who doesn't just move things around, manipulating will, but creates from nothing. Verse 2 is frequently misinterpreted. It does not convey chaotic scenes as if God brought about an unruly situation through which he calls to order. Firstly, the Hebrew expression, the earth was without form and void, simply means that God had created the raw materials, which for a moment were somewhat shapeless and unpopulated, not wild and disorderly. The land, being a material mass, was in some basic form positioned under the water, and therefore not void as in empty space. Furthermore, the only other use of this expression is found in Jeremiah 4:23, and it refers to the uncultivated and uninhabited land of Israel. Thus, the translation without form and void speaks of a mass in a stage that is not yet fully formed and prior to it being fruitful. Now, secondly, commentators place weight on supposed symbolism within the closing words of the verse. Darkness was over the face of the deep. Leaning on ancient extra-biblical influence, they point to the dark, deep water, connecting it with disorder, evil sea monsters, and specifically Satan. Now, the Israelites may have been aware of the antecedent pagan creation epics, such as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, and legitimate connections between the deep water, and Satan can be drawn throughout the scriptures. However, on this occasion, it does not fit the context. Briefly, the word darkness, although symbolic of evil, is not always meant that way. Light had not been created yet. Now, does that mean that God, who is holy, was not there? No, it is simply picturing the moment. It was dark, right? Let's turn to the word deep waters. Now, it has been claimed that the deep of Genesis 1:2, Hebrew Tiom, is a form of Tiamat, the name of the Assyrian Babylonian goddess of salt water associated with chaos. Now, Nahum Sana, a scholar, writes, "It must be remembered, this combat myth, once fully developed, appears in a very attenuated and fragmentary form. And in the biblical sources, the several allusions have to be pieced together into some kind of coherent unity." He goes on to say the Hebrew term tiom is never used with a definite article, something that is characteristic of proper names. Victor Hamilton concurs the deep of Genesis 1 is not personified, and in no way is it viewed as some turbulent antagonistic force. Again, scholar Gordon Wenham declares that the word tiom for deep is not an allusion to the conquest of Tiamat as in the Babylonian myth. So if you crowbar a rebellious persona into verse 2, you are saying the rebellion of angelic beings occurred during the creation week, but as we will discover, Satan and the hosts of heaven are still obedient to God until after the creation week. God said to Job, "When I laid the foundations of the earth, all the sons of God shouted for joy." Now, if the source of this kind of so-called chaos is not a persona, is God battling the forces of nature that he's just created and in control of? All notion of the connection between creation and cosmic battles was banished from Genesis with extreme care. The idea of strife and tension between God and nature is unthinkable. To emphasize the point, the words "and it was so" are repeated after each divine fiat. That's Sana. The Spirit of God is described in verse 3 as hovering over the face of the waters, not battling evil chaos. Hovering is implied elsewhere in Scripture as parental affection and covering. Wenham says there is no hint in the biblical text that the deep was a power independent of God, which he had to fight to control. Furthermore, The concept of God dwelling with chaotic matter before creation, before the completion of creation, would be a contradiction of terms. The God of the Bible is a God of order, not chaos. It is not in his character to bring about a natural state of watery chaos. Order is natural. Chaos is cursed nature. Now, Job 38 describes the precision and care of creation like an architect and craftsman. It refers to the laying the foundation of the earth, its measurements, a stretched line upon it, a cornerstone, the sea with doors, right? Clouds, its garment. This is not a builder who just dumps a load of material on site before he starts forming it, and people walking past thinking, wow, that looks like a chaotic mess. No, this is an engineer who is carefully measuring, laying the foundations, furnishing, etc. He shaped the mountains. He established the fountains of the deep. He marked out the foundations of the earth like a master workman, it says in Proverbs 8. The ancient epics are written from a pagan worldview of the cosmos, whereby the underlying themes are of conflict, of a multiplicity of gods linked to powers of nature, a pantheon of gods contending for Alpha God, one lording power over the other through violence. Right? The Enuma Elish describes antagonistic forces that accounts for the specific formation of creation. Sana says the book of Genesis has no direct reference to the notion of creation in terms of struggle. Indeed, the very idea is utterly alien to the whole atmosphere of the narrative. Satan has inspired false creation accounts to suggest that he was there as forces of nature, right, before his time, hoping to be credited for the form of the cosmos. And we should guard from these falsehoods. Educated in Pharaoh's household, Moses must have been familiar with ancient creation myths. But even if he knew nothing of them, today some would still comment on the similarities and assume that he borrowed aspects, always referencing a hidden meaning in the pagan literature because the Hebrew Bible was written afterwards. The reality is that Satan, who knows the truth, twisted the truth to manipulate people groups. And later Moses is given the truth directly from God, not a partial adaptation of a satanic version. It polemically rebuts and exposes the folly of them. In fact, the whole creation account, like much of Scripture, is a polemic of ancient, present, and future societal thought void of God. And we should read ancient myths in light of the Bible, not the other way round. Now, we do consider the availability of non-biblical ancient texts, but the chronological order does not matter in the same way that biblical books relate. The Bible is not attempting to compete with comic books, but rather cutting through twisted narratives with truth. There is no conflict, there's no rivals of the supreme creator. Now, the ancient Hebrews, they will have viewed the oceans as terrifyingly deep and turbulent. But is that not the point? Like Moses is saying these terrifying waters were once orderly created by our God and who is still in control of them. Personally, I think the influence of ancient creation epics on the human author is overplayed and the inspiration of the divine author underplayed. In terms of biblical motifs, there are kind of dubious connections as well as clear-cut ones. Two phrases are popularly connected with the deep of Genesis 1-2, raising sinister associations. Firstly, the phrase, the deep that crouches beneath of Genesis 49. It's in the context of Jacob blessing his sons, in particular Joseph. It says this, by the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. He's not blessed by a wicked persona of the deep, but blessed from all ends of creation. That's what it's saying. Hamilton translates it as the bounty of heaven above, the bounty of the deep that crouches below, the bounty of the breast and womb. Similarly, the same phrase that's used in Deuteronomy 33 is in the context of Moses blessing the 12 tribes, in particular the tribe of Joseph. It says, "And of Joseph he said, blessed by the Lord be his land, with the choicest gifts of heaven above and of the deep that crouches beneath." Again, the tribe is not blessed by a wicked persona of the deep. Peter Craigie explains, "The deep lying beneath is a poetic description of the subterranean waters which were believed to be the source of springs and rivers, which in turn watered the land and contributed to its fertility." The deep was counted as a blessing. You can't just look at a word like crouches and think, "Ooh, that sounds sinister," right? You can do all things through a text out of context. The deep that gave forth its voice is another phrase called upon in support of the chaos theory, as I call it. And it's from Habakkuk 3. The context here is of a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, which poetically pictures Jesus as the returning warrior. It says this: "The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place." Here, Habakkuk, he does personify aspects of creation. So some say that nature is the picture of God's enemies, right? But verse 8 is evident that the Lord is not angry against the river or the sea. Habakkuk is depicting nature's subjection to Jesus upon his return. His commands move mountains, the seas roar, it gave forth its voice, the sun and moon obedient as in the day of Gibeon. And Michael Reidelnick would agree with me there. In fact, I believe this is talking about the second episode of the sea crossing to come, the second Exodus. We can safely dismiss those passages as support for the chaos theory. Now, in terms of legitimate connections, the Bible speaks of Rahab, distinct from the prostitute of the Canaanite city of Jericho. Rahab who is behind the powers of Egypt and is connected with the dragon and the deep sea, who are defeated by the Lord in an eschatological battle. There is a figure called Leviathan, the twisting serpent, connected with the dragon that is in the sea. See Isaiah 27, Psalm 74, Job 3. Revelation 13 speaks of a beast with 7 heads that rises out of the sea. In chapters 12 and 20, it says that the great dragon, the ancient serpent, is the devil and Satan. So there is a symbolic connection with Rahab, with the dragon, Leviathan, and Satan, and the deep sea. But this is post-creation days, post-fall of man and fall of Satan. We shouldn't pry Satan back into Genesis 1-2 and call it chaos. Quite the opposite. It was calm and majestic, though powerful. Later, Satan would stir up chaos, be associated with the deep, that God will one day tame again. I don't see a foreshadowing of chaos to order in Genesis 1. It cannot be. Listen to Hamilton. The biblical writers deliberately use these mythical allusions, not in the setting of creation, but in the context of redemption. There is no evil inherent in the world that God has made. Where is evil conquered? In creation? No. Rather, evil and chaos and disruption are conquered within time in the redemption of God's people. So, in conclusion, in Genesis 1-2, the deep is not personified. Satan is still obedient at this point. As we'll find out in a moment, if Satan is linked to sea monsters, the sea monsters were not created until day 5. The Spirit of God is depicted as affectionately covering the waters. It's a contradiction of terms. It's a polemic of pagan accounts. There are fewer dots throughout the scriptures than we often connect, and legitimate biblical motifs should not be fired back into the creation account with a pagan arrow. Verse 2 of creation is the continuation of a beautiful picture of God perfectly and lovingly ordering materials, not subduing chaos. A plain reading of verse 2 means that he creates materials in basic form and then shaped and ordered them ready to be populated. Now, I appreciate I've labored this point, right? But many people are misinterpreting and they're running with it and they're publishing books and videos, and I'm dismayed with the distortions, and we should correct each other where necessary. Various views have developed as to how to translate the first 3 verses. The original Hebrew and early Aramaic manuscripts were written not only without vowels, as common in modern Hebrew, but without punctuation too. The key question is, how does verse 1 relate to the text that follows? The first 3 verses can be seen to flow together as one spoken unit, depicting the continuous and rhythmic process of creation. And for some time, Jewish interpreters have read the first 3 sentences as one long sentence. So, for example, the first 2 verses can be seen composed of dependent clauses and verse 3 as the main clause. It can therefore be translated as follows: in the beginning of God's creating the sky and the dry land, while the land was still uninhabitable and unproductive, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, Robert Alter, I have to say, Robert Alter must win the award for the best looking the best looking interpretation with a commentary. It really is beautiful, and he translates the 3 as one, and he begins it with when God began to create heaven and earth. Now, as Hamilton points out, the result is an unusually long and rambling sentence. Now, what's more is that Alter, who I really appreciate, by the way, the Alter's translation of verse 1 and similar constructs is the equivalent of the first 2 lines of the Enuma Elish. Now, considering the creation account is a polemic, I doubt God would render it almost identically. It opens the door to something existing before verse 1, such as chaotic matter dwelling with God, which I trust we've debunked, rather than creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. There is no doubt in my mind that creation had an absolute beginning as a direct creation of God, which is described in verse 1. Discussion pivots around whether the opening word bereshit is in the absolute state, is an intermediate noun, or a constructive state, which determines its trajectory, but we won't go into that. Translations are determined somewhat by theology. To a degree, they are an interpretation. Now, there are those who hold theologies that require a time gap to be inserted between verse 1 and 2. And now some require a long time gap to fit their theory of evolution. Others desire a short time gap within the day even for the fall of Satan to take place, appealing to Ezekiel 28. Arnold Frutenbaum takes this position, for example, though he does affirm 24-hour days. I will demonstrate in future sessions why I don't believe Ezekiel 28 is referring to Satan, but also that passage is referring to the Garden of Eden, which had not been created at this stage, and the earth was entirely underwater, hence formless and void. Neither gap is necessary. Some translators, I think, are genuinely pursuing the truthful construct influenced by their theological assumptions, others seeking to vindicate their own pet theories. Rydalnik argues it is impossible to infer any historical gap between any of the clauses in these 3 verses. Reviewing the historical positions, Wenham explains to some length the reasons why he prefers to translate verse 1 as the main clause, describing the first act of creation. Verse 2 and 3 describe the subsequent phases in God's creative activity. And he notes that this was the standard view from the 3rd century BC. In agreement, Hamilton suggests that verse 1 should be translated as an independent clause, a main clause, and therefore its own sentence, with the traditional breaks providing 3 verses. And he says that this fits the overall style of the chapter, as does the Complete Jewish Bible, and most English translations today favour the 3-verse division, which should be read chronologically, viewed as activity within the first day of creation, without insertion of our own ideas. What is evident is there is this kind of musical and almost kind of poetic tempo to the creation account. God is the soloist, the narrator, the accompanist. But do not confuse the artistic nature with a pleasant story detached from reality. Genesis is history. It may not be a science textbook, and thank goodness, because they change all the time, but it is scientifically accurate. And its precision of word placement has dazzled commentators for millennia. On day 1 of history, having brought about a starting point that ticks forwards and a volume in which he placed raw materials consisting largely of water, God spoke and created light, positioning it from an all-encompassing brightness to become more focused. And this separation of light from darkness means that God can now see the beauty of the light. Now, before the separation, God saw and declared the status of the light as good. Now, if you insert chaos before this, you are forced to insert 2 additional status points into the creation account, namely good and then chaotic bad, before God declared it good. Personally, I will stick with God's quality-controlled declarations. Now, Jewish rabbis coined the Hebrew expression Shekinah glory. You may have heard that before, which means that he caused to dwell, denoting the presence or the dwelling of the Lord God on the earth. Now, could it be said that this light signified the Shekinah glory, the intention of God from the moment of his first recorded words was to dwell on earth with people, the status of which would be good. Light would become symbolic of life, deliverance, the law of God, communing with God, the essence of God. Paul would go on to say, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." Echoing the creation account, John writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." In the first chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus is the Word, the light, the only Son from the Father. 2 chapters later, he says, "The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil." Works done unto the Lord are done with the inner light and under the light of Messiah and declared good. It was his light in the first place, and so he takes the credit for any of our good works. Through Isaiah, God says, "I form light and I create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things." Interesting that God declares the light good before it is separated from darkness, prophetic of the future story. Light was universal and declared good before darkness entered the world, when light would become distinct and limited. And now that does not mean the reality of darkness in and of itself is wicked, but that he created light and darkness to set up symbols to represent well-being and calamity, or good and evil, or blessing and judgment, etc. There is no calamity in the creation account, but symbols that would help demonstrate spiritual, moral, and divine realities. Isaiah, for example, would later write, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. A hint to the light of Messiah who would rise upon Israel. The separation of light from darkness is the first of 5 separations, all of which speak of light or water. The process of separation is synonymous with divine election. Later, Israel would learn to distinguish between the holy and the common, the unclean and the clean. Light is elected to live under. Right? The waters above, aside from the kind of encapsulating waters, which we'll come on to, include the rain that provides drinking water. To divide and distinguish means he is the lawgiver. Right? Created laws that uphold the divisions, and who dare confuse them? In an expression of his supreme authority, God gives light and dark the names day and night. Naming is part of the separating, defining roles and purpose. Creation happens in light. God does not require the sun to illuminate his work. The creating of light anticipates the creation of the heavenly lights. The formation of light created a shadowy darkness upon one side of the matter, preparing the way for sleep patterns, agricultural cycles, and so forth. Sleep patterns they're a gift from God, giving us rest. For 1/3 of our lives, we are unconscious to the world around us. They remind us that we are weak without the creator and sustainer of all. In his mercy, he curtails the day's accumulation of sin. My shepherd makes me lie down. He restores my soul. To rest our mind, our tongue, our body, we lie down each night only to be raised in power and strength. On the first day we read there was evening and morning. So the unformed earth had begun to spin in some fashion at this point. Rotating eastward means the sun would rise in the east. The scriptures point to a spherical earth. Solomon wrote, the sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to its place where it rises. Isaiah indicates God's dwelling in relation to the sphere or circle of the earth. It is he says, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth. God set the earth's axial tilt, which may have been somewhat less than the 23, I think it's 23.4 degrees today, that would generate the seasons. Evening came before morning because the darkness preceded the light, and this set forth the pattern of the day beginning with evening before morning. Unlike our days on the Gregorian calendar, which kind of start and end at midnight, God's calendar days are determined by sundown to sundown. Hence, the morning is really in the middle of the day. God worked in the day and not the night, and this sets up the pattern for the working week. A literary pattern can be seen throughout Genesis 1 that describe the stages of each creation. So firstly, you have announcement, God said. Secondly, the commanding word, let there be. Thirdly, the fulfillment, and it was so, and there was. Fourthly, the description of execution, and God separated or made, so God created. Fifthly, the approval, God saw that it was good. Number 6, naming or blessing, and God called, God blessed. And number 7, the concluding formula with the day number. There was evening and morning, day. So now, it is conceivable that the sevenfold pattern was followed throughout each creative work, or each creative day had at least 7, though only verses 3 to 5 on day 1 include all stages of the 7 standard formulae in simple sequence. Now, the 7th day did not include creative acts. But if a different kind of sevenfold formula was employed, we would have 7 times 7 equals 49, the stages which should make us think of the Jubilee and the Pentecost and so forth. And we can see several similar elements, including, so you've got like an announcement of ceasing from work. God finished his work. Number 3, that he had done. And number 4, description of implementation, and he rested, God rested. Number 6, blessing, so he blessed. Number 7, the day number, the 7th day, the description of execution and declaring it holy, and God made it holy. Now, this is something that I've pondered, but I'm not aware of anyone making that connection. So I could be seeing something there that isn't there. But it's certainly interesting, and it would be unsurprising from a God of logic and maths and time and musicality. Day 2. On day 2, God created an expanse, separating the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And in this way, God stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, thus defining the water planet, as we call it, with space between it and the outer cosmic waters. When NASA announces discoveries of water deposits on other planets, it should come as no surprise to those who understand that not only the earth was formed out of water and through water, as Peter said, but the entire cosmos. Now, this vast space between the earth's water and the outer waters of the universe are called heavens, plural. Deuteronomy describes the expanse as the heaven and the heaven of heavens. Our atmosphere would be the inner or first heaven, sometimes translated sky, in which the birds fly. The expanse we refer often to as space, a secondary heaven, and an outer or third heaven beyond that, which I'm sure God keeps clear from our telescopes. As we'll find out, for good reason, God dwells there. The waters above, which are not mentioned again, encapsulate the 3-story universe. In separating the waters, God moved from a compressed expanse and stretched it out to create a plurality of heavens. Isaiah 42 says, he created the heavens and stretched them out. Chapter 44 says, who alone stretched out the heavens. Psalm 104 says, stretching out the heavens like a tent. Stretching like a tent, a cosmic tabernacle readied for God to dwell within. The use of the Hebrew word for expanse throughout the scriptures is particularly interesting. Ezekiel 1:22, the LEB version, says, an expanse like the outward appearance of awesome ice. The same verse in the ESV version says an expanse shining like awe-inspiring crystal spread out. Daniel 12:3, the LEB version, shine like the brightness of the expanse. Can you, like him, spread out the skies, hard as a cast metal mirror? Job 37:18, the ESV. Now, I prefer the word expanse, but it can be translated as firmament or vault. The LEB translates the expanse in Genesis 1 as a vaulted dome. The Hebrew word rakia comes from the Hebrew root raka, which means to spread out or stretch, like we just read in Isaiah, or to trample, stamp out, or beat out. Exodus 39:3, they hammered out thin sheets of gold. Numbers 16:38, made into hammered plates as a covering for the altar. The same verse, the LEB version, gilded leaf plating. Isaiah 40:19, a goldsmith overlays it with gold. A beaten silver is translated in Jeremiah 10:9. Proverbs 8 reads, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew the circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above. So God defines the circle or the spherical shape of the water planet, and then he firms up the heavens. The expanse then is connected with firming up, working hard like metal, polishing it bright, shiny, like a mirror or ice crystal. The outer waters God separated could be a canopy of water that encapsulates the universe, an encapsulated expanse with a shimmering, hammered outer layer of ice. And it's these kinds of insights that help build your worldview of the cosmic tabernacle we dwell within. The separation of waters is the second separation after light. The vertical parting of the waters to bring forth new creation foreshadows the horizontal parting of the waters on day 3, and in turn, the parting of the waters in the Exodus account, which in turn foreshadows a future separation of waters unto the formation of a special creation. With the outer heavens in place, God's heavenly abode from day 2 and onwards is now a possibility. The approval aspect of the sevenfold formulae is missing in the passage, perhaps, as Wenham suggests, because the waters were not fully separated until the following day. Or could it be that the heavenly temple was in the process of being built and it wasn't appropriate for an approval mid-build? There's a thought. God is pictured as a potter spreading out the sky, and next he will spread out the earth. The author moves from heaven's throne to the abode of man to reflect on the earth. All elements are ready to be shaped. Day 3, and God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. On day 3, God gathers the waters on our planet together to let the dry land appear. This is the third separation, the water parting for new creation on the land. Now, it does not mean that the land was all in one place and the sea was one kind of surrounding it. Verse 10 says seas plural, so they were shapes of continents and islands for man to explore. There's a spreading out, creating kind of mountain ranges and valleys, some of which would become lakes and so forth. Although it would look somewhat different from our post-flood world today. Scripture is adamant that God created alone. Isaiah says, "Who spread out the earth by myself." You know, the tools that we use today, the jewelry, cars, phones, planes, it's easy to forget the work that God did in these first few days of creation. God has enriched the earth with elements and metals, precious stones for man to discover, make with, build with, and fill the earth with his glory. Now, naturally, we tend to focus on the land, but we mustn't forget the seas. In the context of creation, Psalm 33 says, "He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He puts the deeps in storehouses." It's his storehouses to do as he pleases. Seas are like giant reservoirs, storehouses that God can use to bless people with and to judge people. A deep world for the fish life and for man to explore. The Bible refers to ocean springs. Job 38 says, "Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep?" Proverbs 8, he established the fountains of the deep. Now, it wasn't until the 1960s that man discovered springs on the seafloor. It seems that God also houses these kind of giant stores of water under the seafloor to use as and when he pleases. Psalm 104 poetically depicts the aspects of creation. Verses 6 to 9 describe the spreading out of the earth. It says, "You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set the boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth." God covers the earth with a garment of water. A garment speaks of protection and provision, and it's designed to precisely fit. The relationship between land and sea is not out of control, prominent in modern thought. They rise or sink to their appointed place. The seas have set boundaries. The land and water, they work together to support life. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. The land he calls earth, and the waters he calls seas. The naming reveals God's continual and direct authority over. This is the last time, though, that he will name anything. From here on, he will cease to name. Man will be given that authority to name. Now, after this first work on day 3, once again he declares his creation as good. In a second creative act, God commands a covering for the earth with vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit. He clothes the earth with greenery, and this covering also provides a home with food in abundance. There is essentially 3 divisions of vegetation. There's grass and grain, there's herbs and vegetation, and fruit trees. Although, because the first listed is a kind of broader term for vegetation, followed by two types or representatives that are then defined or qualified. Some argue only 2 divisions are referred to. The plants and trees that are self-propagating are edible for man. The former bear their seeds externally, and the latter bear theirs internally inside the fruit. God has given them the capacity to reproduce. I'm inclined to go with 3 divisions, 2 of which are then made distinct because they qualify for cultivation and consumption, as man is the focus. Also, grass and grain and such like must have been created at some point, so it makes sense here within the broader term of the first mention on day 3. They would sprout each according to its kind. 10 times the word kind is used in Genesis 1. God is dogmatic about distinctions between kinds. Within vegetation, there is distinct separation of kinds. DNA would allow for variation of species, but each is limited to its kind or family group. Psalm 104 says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment." God covers himself with light as with a garment, and he does unto men as he does to himself. He covers above their heads with a garment of light, and then surrounds with a garment of water and a garment of vegetation. For the 3rd time in the week, and for the first time a second approval of the day, he declares his creation good. Now, creation symmetry. There is a pattern and symmetry to the creation week, signaling that both context and form of the text matters. The first 3 days provide the realms to be occupied over the following 3 days. Day 1 provides universal space, which will be expanded on day 2, to be occupied on creation day 4. Day 2 provides the atmospheric heaven and ocean realms for the flying and sea creatures on day 5. And finally, day 3 provides the earthly, the land realm to be occupied on day 6. Within the symmetry, there is also a connection between the materials of creation. Light created on day 1 is assigned to the heavenly lights on day 4. The air and water created on day 2, necessary for life forms on day 5. Vegetation on day 3 will be for food and furnishing for man and animals created on day 6. We can see also that the first half of the working week has 4 creative acts, and so too the second half has 4 creative acts. What is more is that day 1 and day 2 each has 1 creative act, followed by day 3 with 2 creative acts. In the same pattern, day 4 and 5 each has 1 creative act, followed by day 6 with 2 creative acts. It reveals something about authorial intention. Musical rhythms of the creation account are they're precise, and they behold ordered beauty and beauty of order. Wenham notes the chiastic pattern throughout the first section of the creation week from 1:1 to 3, chapter 2, verse 3. Although the English verse 1:1 begins, God created heavens and earth, the Hebrew is actually ordered, created God heavens and earth. And at the end of the week, it is reversed, heavens and earth, God created, a reflection within the wording, illustrating the reflection of man and his kingdom to God and the heavenly kingdom. Seen in the creative acts, the text also reveals 2 poles, heaven and earth, like heaven coming down to earth and remaining entwined. So we have, starting at the top, day 1 down to day 6, we have heaven, heaven, earth, heaven, earth, earth. Day 4. Day 4 is halfway of the week with 3 days either side. The space that was created on day 1, which was expanded on day 2, is now filled with a beautiful array of galaxies. On day 4, God creates the sun, taking up the task from the light on day 1, the moon and the stars, placing them in the mid-heavens to be seen on earth. As well as the immediate bodies that circle the earth, God created all the planets and their constellations. Genesis categorizes them together as lights or luminaries. This group together functions a threefold purpose: to separate the day from the night, to be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, and to illuminate the earth, to give light upon the earth. Verses 17 to 18 is a clear summary. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. We see a threefold function that is reflected from verse 14 to 18, divide, rule, give light, each mentioned twice, mirroring one another. Within the function of ruling, there are 3 categories: this heavenly signs, the festal seasons, and days and years. Signs can be further categorized. In Genesis 1, the sun is referred to as the greater light, and the moon is referred to as the lesser light. Hamilton explains that the Hebrew names for the sun and moon are very similar in other Semitic languages, often representing mythical divinities, and therefore God refuses to name them, at least in the Genesis record. And following suit, the author does not use the typical Hebrew words for sun and moon found elsewhere in the Old Testament. The message is clear: man is not to personify them or deify them. Contrasting the creation myths, the created light should point to the Creator. They are not to be worshipped or to be served by man, but to serve man. While it does name the stars, it does so as a kind of an aside or an anticlimax, and the stars. Some translations say the stars also. And this contrasts the Babylonian creation myth that held that the stars as the highest rank, followed by the moon and then the sun, the opposite order. God is making the polemical point: these myths are false. The Genesis account is the truth. Worship none but me. The vastness of the galaxies would not only instill an awe and fear of our Creator, but also be a tool for telling the story and attest to God's active part in redemptive history, in his loving kindness for knowing that sin would wreck his relationship with man. He set the stage of creation with the capacity to signpost his plan of redemption. These lights in space, which he gives to all of them their names, according to Psalm 147. So perhaps he does, but he doesn't tell you. Form what we call today the zodiac. The zodiac, which from the Greek word, which means living circle or circle of animals. And the zodiac contains fixed pictures in the sky, controlled only by God's laws of the heavens. And there are 12 main pictures in the constellations that show throughout the year that would be for signs for those on earth. In his infinite wisdom, each formation a picture story, signaling a message of the necessary steps of episodes before ultimate redemption, declaring the end from the beginning. The 12 pictures that form a continuous circle around the earth are a woman, a pair of scales, a scorpion, an archer, a goatfish, a man holding a cauldron, 2 fish, a lamb, an ox, twin boys, a crab, and a lion. The story to watch for then begins with a woman and ends with a lion. As the earth is set in motion, these kind of stick pictures swipe from east to west. In the day, the sun illuminates the atmosphere, what's called clothing the picture, obscuring the stars during the day. And due to precession, the constellations shift a tiny amount each year relative to our seasons. It is a divine clock with built-in precession. From the beginning, God is speaking, broadcasting across the skies for all humanity. Excuses will be found wanting. Now, that man and Satan have twisted the meaning of the pictures in the skies, such as horoscopes, Christians today they're wary of any messages in the sky. And I want to make it clear, abundantly clear, stay away from horoscopes and such like. It will poison you. Now, at the same time, like all reactionary theology, we've made the mistake to say that the sky means nothing. And for this reason, we're missing God's biggest billboard aired nightly. Listen to the words of David's Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. Genesis is clear. They are to serve us with signs that point to his blueprint. Consider these words in the book of Job. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Oregon? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth, the constellations, in their season? Or can you guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on earth? Within the subdivision of signs, we could say there are 3 categories. The daily, nightly signs, so you have the zodiac at night, the daily navigational use, and they are a sign of Israel's perpetuity. The irregular, but perhaps more expected signs like a rainbow or storms, and then special celestial signs that mark an imminent event, such as in Isaiah 38, when the Lord gave a physical sign in the light to signal he was about to fulfill a promise. Or the sun, remember the sun that stopped shining when Jesus was on the cross. Or the list of celestial eschatological signs. Now, as well as signs, the planetary systems make for seasons and days and years. Commentators agree that days and years are connected in the same grouping. And days mean the Earth that spins on an axis will rotate once in 24 hours. Years means the Earth rotates around the sun once a year. And these lights could now generate seasonal weather conditions and mark time. Psalm 104 says, he made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness and it is night. The seasons mean agricultural cycles and the capacity for festivals. In fact, seasons can be translated as appointed times or fixed times, which causes us to think of the appointed feast days and periods given to Israel. Paul Beauchamp suggests that by mentioning fixed times, seasons, on the fourth day of creation, the author is hinting that Wednesday was often a day on which great festivals, and in particular New Year's Day, always fell. If the original Jubilee calendar is considered, it's a possibility. God set the world in motion from the season of new life, spring. It would become the biblical new year given to Israel, the first of Aviv or Nisan in Exodus 12. We take the makeup of the universe for granted, don't we? But imagine if there was no day or night. Imagine if the weather was the same every day, with no seasons. There was no rise or fall of the tides from the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun. Right? It'd be incredibly difficult to discern time and daily and monthly and yearly cycles. That God created it as such confronts us with the fact that time is ticking and that we experience seasons physically, agriculturally, spiritually, and it will not always be like this. They teach man about the cyclic nature of history, not in a Greek sense, but in a way that God can teach us through foreshadows throughout redemptive history. Seasons teach us that pain and dark times are temporal, and that new life will come if we patiently endure. That a day is coming, a fixed day, a unique day that will be a day unlike any other. Now, I don't know about you, but pictures of galaxies, pictures of them, they provide me with this deep sense of awe. And David, as a shepherd boy, would lay in the fields watching the stars at nighttime and would later write, "You have set your glory above the heavens. I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place." All separation is done by day 4, the midpoint. Separation distinguishes one from another. It means in God's awesome power, he divides, selects, chooses, prepares the way for new life, blessing, cultivation, responsibility. First, we noted the black and white of day and night on day 1, and then the blue skies and seas, along with the browns and the reds of the earth, littered with a glittering of metals and stones, and then the green clothing of the earth with grass and veg and trees, and now the greys of the moon and the yellow sun and stars to complete the rainbow. Man will soon add to the colour mix. Day 5. For the 6th time of the week, day 5 begins with God said. He created the sea creatures and birds. Day 5 corresponds with day 2, the vertical separation of the water, producing the skies provide space for the birds to fly, and the waters below the dwelling for the sea creatures. Although translated birds, these flying creatures include bats, birds, bats, flying insect, pterodactyl, and so forth. These fly across the expanse of the heavens, or across the face of the vaulted dome of heaven, the LEB says. They fly across the expanse, the firmament, the vault, across the vault as a backdrop, the distant kind of ice dome, if you please. Now, of course, the outer dome is impossible for us to see. Our atmosphere, the inner heaven, provides the colours of a painting. The aquatic creatures are categorized into 2 groups. Firstly, the large creatures. You've got mammals and reptiles, which includes whales, shark, crocodiles, large snakes, and marine dinosaur like the plesiosaur. Now, sometimes translated as great sea monsters, the literal translation is the great reptiles. And these great creatures, as awe-inspiring as they may be, should not be worshipped. Other cultures worshipped great creatures such as the crocodile and the leviathan. Genesis is clear: God created the great sea creatures to display his skill and his might. Now, we touched on these great sea monsters who would become symbolic of beings who rebelled against God. But in the same way that light and dark are symbols, nothing was corrupted or competing for power at this time. Hamilton asserts Genesis 1 does not even hint of a battle. The Tannanim, the sea monsters, are simply large creatures of the water and are created by God. Again, these powerful creatures, they do not depict chaos or a battle. There was harmony. Psalm 147 says, "Praise the Lord from the earth, you great sea creatures and all deeps." To behold an awe and later a fear of these powerful creatures that could easily destroy us, apply then an infinite multiple to those emotions about the heavenly one who is infinitely more powerful and majestic, and of whom the sea creatures are called to praise. The second category were the shoals of smaller fish and creeping life along the bed. Psalm 104 says, "Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. An abundant realm for abundant life." Again, they are created according to their kinds, distinct family kinds with variation of species, but limited to their own kind. One kind cannot become another kind. Having inspected and declared it was good, for the first time, God speaks to somebody. Here we observe the first blessing in verse 22, telling them to be fruitful and multiply. The ESV uses the word swarm 3 times, delivering an overtone of multiplication and fertility. He blesses and then orders in that sequence. The blessing involves the capacity to reproduce, and the order being the expansion of life that God sees as good. Day 6. On day 6, God begins with creating the land animals. There are 3 main groups of cattle, so livestock, the large domesticated quadrupeds, creeping and crawling things, so mice, reptiles, insects, etc., and all other beasts, wild animals of the earth. Let the earth bring forth suggests that these living creatures were created out of the ground. The higher animals on day 6 and Adam were made from the ground, but the process will differ for Adam. The term livestock indicates a kind of tame group of animals which would remain with a tame nature throughout the generations, God's provision and foresight even beyond sin. Wild animals does not mean that they have a kind of an aggressive disposition, but an independence as opposed to the tameable animals that are kind of useful for everyday tasks. The creation of land animals will have included all extinct animals also, including, yes, the dinosaur kinds. Now, our minds, they kind of rush to images of Jurassic Park, but we have to remind ourselves that God's creatures lived in relative harmony, and they wouldn't be hunting each other or man for food. These land animals, they do not receive a direct blessing followed by an order or a command like the flying and water creatures. It is reserved only for the first day of creating animate life and human life later on. Perhaps because the blessing of man covered the works of day 6, or because man would be responsible for the population growth to ensure they were a help and not competition for dominance of the land. The Psalms once more show that God has not just haphazardly spread out the earth, but he's made a fit for everything. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. Again, there is a kind of reflection, a chiastic order within the passage. You have livestock and creeping things, beasts of the earth, livestock and creeping things. patterns within patterns, layers of literary beauty. Now, before turning to the creation of man, God declares his work as good. Man is the climax of creation. The distinctiveness of humanity is emphasized. The earth was the focal point of his creation, and now man is the focus of his creation upon the earth. The triune nature of God is seen in the creation of man. Unlike his previous creative acts, in verse 26, there is an announcement in the first person, God's intention. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let us in our, after our." These plural pronouns make perfect sense when you understand the Godhead to encompass three persons. Now, those who question the doctrine of the Trinity must ask who God was speaking to, if not himself. Now, at least 6 different explanations have been given, including a mythical God speaking to lesser gods, God speaking to the earth, God singular speaking of himself and within himself in a plural of majesty, self-deliberation of God, God speaking to the heavenly courts made up of angelic creatures, and of course the proper Christian explanation that us and our refer to the plurality of the Godhead. Now, I trust we do not need to refute the first 4, so we'll deal with the heavenly court. Firstly, God created alone, and the creation account is uninterested in angelology, so it could not be referring to the heavenly council. Now, Frutenbaum makes the point that when the angelic court is consulted, Scripture tells us so, such as 1 Kings 22. If God was including a number of angelic creatures in the plural, then man would also be made in the image of them too. Angelic creatures, they radically vary in terms of appearance, capability, purpose, and so forth. And therefore, it's a kind of guessing game who God is including, which then determines our reflected image. The following verse underscores the process, saying, "in his own image, in the image of God." Here we see the use of his, him, rather than our, us. And this shows the kind of unity in the Godhead, but also making it abundantly clear that man is created in the image of God, Elohim, not the divine council who are created beings. Now, some may argue that God was announcing to the divine council, like to the divine council, rather than about them, and therefore not including the angelic beings in the plurality. But again, there's no clear reference to the council, and the account is starkly uninterested in angelology. Now, in terms of how aware Moses was of the things he wrote, the creation account is unique. I would appeal to a dictation from God. Moses did not have to completely understand each and every point of meaning and significance. Having said that, Moses had already mentioned the Holy Spirit in verse 2, so he could have been aware that there were at least 2 persons in the Godhead just from the text alone. The Israelites, they could have understood this, but they could not have grasped a heavenly council at this stage. Hamilton explains, "Most plausible to me is the explanation that sees in the us a plural of fullness or plurality within the Godhead. God the Father announced to the Son and Spirit, the Son created as a potter, and the Spirit helps and sustains and invades man. The creation of man is an extension of God's love. If there is no plurality within the Godhead, who was loving who before creation without the company of 3 persons? God moves from let there be to let us make. Humanity is the only creative act that is described as not just a verbal command, but a physical creation. Something special is about to take place. Genesis 1 provides a summary in 1 verse of God creating mankind. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Genesis 2 then gives more details about the steps creating the male and female, and we will follow this pattern and look at the details of that in the episode on the Garden of Eden. The image of God is only used 4 times in the Old Testament. The same Hebrew word for image can mean a physical image or model or picture. In Genesis 5:3, Seth, the son of Adam, is after his image. Image in the Septuagint, the earliest Greek translation of the Old Testament, is icon, E-I-K-O-N, icon, which is where we get the word icon. God was the original icon. Adam would be the original human icon. The phrase image of God was used to call kings in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. It detailed the king's function and being, but not appearance. Now, in some sense, God is saying there's a royalty about all of mankind. And the Israelites who had recently left Egypt would understand this first man is to be the royal king. And we will return to this later. Genesis 1 is the only place where the 2 nouns image and likeness are connected in the Old Testament, and much has been written to kind of decipher the precise meaning of image and likeness and how they are related. They have been explained as distinct aspects. Some have said the image is referring to the physical, the natural aspect, and likeness, the kind of spiritual and mental, and others have argued the opposite. It appears almost impossible to categorize them separately. Perhaps that is the point. The biblical worldview does not conform to the kind of dualism. The natural and the spiritual are entwined. To avoid confusion is to avoid confusion that the word likeness is added as a modifier. Likeness adds limiting clarity. We're not an exact image, right? But we are an image somewhat in the likeness of God. Adam is not begotten from God. He's not an exact reproduction of God or God in any way, but made in the likeness thereof. In the likeness adds detail to in the image. The Hebrew in the likeness is similar to according to, after the pattern of. It parallels with the wording of the tabernacle, right? To be made after the pattern of in Exodus. It could be translated according to our likeness, to be like, to resemble, to bear witness of. We are proof there is a God. You want proof there's a God? You are proof, right? And he made us to tabernacle with and in. We're not exactly the same, right? We are like him. Man sees, hears, speaks, rests on the 7th day like God. Yet we can only make, we cannot create like God. And our bodies die unlike God, but our spirit lives for eternity like God. Likeness conveys not merely physical attributes. What is clear is that man is set apart. Now, firstly, there is the spiritual aspect that man is made in the image of. The identity of man is his soul, which is spirit, meaning once created. We are eternal beings. Man's body is not only home to his spirit, but designed to receive the Spirit of God, a 3-in-1 reflective image of the Trinity. Secondly, we do not discount the physical aspect. We are not bodies, but we have bodies. Right? The human body is made in the image of God. He has chosen to relate to us in a man-shaped body, and he has made us in the image of such. Man's upright posture sets him apart from all life on earth. Original man stands before God, a dignified, regal, and righteous reflection. Thirdly, we bear an image of God's morality. Original righteousness was the status of man in those first days after creation. Let me quote John Wesley. Original righteousness is said to be that moral rectitude in which Adam was created. His reason was clear, and sense, appetite, and passion were subject to it. His judgment was uncorrupted, and his will had a constant propensity to holiness. He had a supreme love of his Creator, a fear of offending him, and a readiness to do his will. Man has been gifted with a conscience to discern good from evil. Conscience, con, meaning with, science, meaning knowledge, suggests that we act with knowledge of God's universal laws imprinted on our hearts. Man, as the image bearer, is accountable to the true image for his actions. Fourthly, a mental capacity. We are blessed with reason, including the abstract, philosophical, logic, creativity, the ability to learn, and as Grudem says, develop greater skill and complexity in technology, in agriculture, in science, and nearly every field of endeavor. Man is self-conscious, has a sense of shame and will. Man has an awareness of the future. All these things set us apart from animals. Lastly, man is relational. He is given the capacity for fellowship with God through prayer. Instinctive or kind of intuitive feelings that we call emotions, humor, musicality, and communication, speech, facial expression and recognition, signed language, literature. The bearing of the image of God indicates a profound oneness of mankind, all reflect in equal measure as precious beings before our Creator. Perhaps above all, to image God is a status. Man represents God on earth. As a representative, or as representatives, we utilize our ability because of our status for God's purposes and mission. While animals come in many kinds, man in one united kind. Mankind has only ever existed as mankind and will only ever be mankind. Wenham asserts what God has distinguished and created distinct, man ought not to confuse. Order, not chaos, is the hallmark of God's activity. We must be willing to accept his decree, putting aside our philosophical and scientific presuppositions. In Genesis 1, only mankind is separated by sexuality. While animals are divided into male and female, it's not mentioned in the creation story. It's only mentioned later in Noah's time. Made from the same building blocks, so to speak, as animals, DNA, the degree to which we are uncommon is vast. A friend of mine once said, "Why do people say animals are like humans? Like, wow, aren't animals so intelligent?" And then he says, "When was the last time you saw a dog flying a helicopter?" Right? The point stands. The verse 27 begins with the creation of image bearers and closes with reference to both male and female. It makes clear that both sexes bear his image. Hamilton explains, God created in his image a male Adam and a female Adam. Both share the image of God. Their sexuality is a gift from God, foreshadowing the blessing of fertility. Between the first man and woman housed the richest DNA to produce everyone on earth, every eye colour, every hair form, every skin tone, every build type, etc., free from genetic imperfection, unquestionably beautiful beings with the greatest capacity of image-bearing ability of mankind that has ever lived. Contrary to the evolutionary narrative that depicts early man as primitive, the first man and woman were the most naturally sophisticated, well-formed, untapped talent to ever live. It would be downhill from here. Racism must stare deeply into the fact that everyone on this planet has descended from the same stock. We are, in a real sense, one big family. It should compel us to not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The creation of woman is last because of divine recognition of the human need for companionship. Pagan epics depict a beginning whereby male and female powers begat gods. And the truth is that in the beginning, God, who is without female counterpart, created mankind with distinctions between male and female. After the initial announcement, the second sentence of verse 26 immediately provides the purpose of his creation in man. And then after the creation of man in verse 27, the following verse, as if to sandwich it in, sees God bless and commission them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. As one, the man and woman were first blessed, and then as a team given a twofold assignment: procreate and exercise dominion. But it is not simply about having kids and ruling, the purpose being primarily about the expansion of righteous life, multiplying good fruit. Thus, God's glory would be extended around the globe. To multiply and fill the earth means God has global plans. Sex is not sinful within marriage, rather it is commanded. Unlike the animals who received a blessing on day 5 as image bearers, they are to be fruitful and multiply, representing God. It cannot be overstated that the fulfillment of first blessing given to man is connected with the life of the human seed. Wenham makes a bold statement about this joining of man and woman. Here then we have a clear statement of the divine purpose of marriage. Positively, it is for the procreation of children. Negatively, it is a rejection of the ancient Oriental fertility cults. God desires his people to be fruitful. His promise makes any participation in such cults or the use of other devices to secure fertility not only redundant, but a mark of unbelief. Strong stuff. A side topic that I haven't delved into, so I will leave that thought for you to mull over. Blessing from God is a theme of Genesis. Animals, mankind, seventh day, Adam, Noah, the patriarchs. Today, we speak of man's success, don't we? But a biblical worldview speaks of God's blessing. Now, of course, the general principles of daily decisions add up, but look at the patriarchs. Infertile, yet able to conceive a nation. Foolish actions, yet gained great affluence. This assignment or order given to the first man and woman is regarded as the first of the 613 commandments of ancient Jewish tradition. Perhaps the order should not be seen as a command as such in which one breaks. Otherwise, would we not have to count the order accompanied with the blessing to the animals on day 5 as a command? But they are not moral creatures to break a command, right? The order is bound to the blessing. John Sailhammer explains, since the introductory statement identifies them as a blessing, the imperatives are not to be understood as commands in this verse. Moreover, the imperative, along with the jussive, is the common mood of the blessing. Either way, God blesses them and then tells them to run with it, as opposed to running contrary to it. What's more is the blessing empowers the order. There's an implicit promise that God will help them to carry out the order. Originally, man was able not to sin and able to sin. The Israelites would read the blessing here as something very real, right? Very real, possessing the enormous creative power of God. Blessing was to set free man to fulfill God's purposes. They are commanded, but in doing so, they will be blessed. The image of, in verse 27, is connected to be fruitful, multiply, subdue, have dominion of verse 28. The image carries the abilities, gifting, the mental capacity, the will, etc., that distinguishes man from animal to enable him to be successful in mission. And this reminds me of the new covenant. God empowering and giving you the ability, the spiritual capacity and a heart to fulfill his commands. Now, I'm not familiar with anyone else that's made that connection, but you can see the parallels, and we'll look more closely to see that God does make a covenant with Adam in the garden. To exercise dominion is a royal duty, a royal assignment. Verse 28 includes subdue, which is a stronger word than let them have dominion in verse 26, almost as if force is implied if necessary. Now, that does not mean that they were allowed to kill or eat the animals they were to dominate. Man is to subdue both the earth and its creatures of the air, sea, or land. Now, the man was regal, an image bearer of God, the focus of creation, blessed and gifted, given authority to subdue, contrasts the ancient mythical creation stories, whereby man was considered as an addendum and maintenance of land as an undignified existence. Man's purpose was to rule over the animal world on God's behalf as the image and in the image of God. It is directly because he is created in his image that they are to have dominion. Nature is to be subjected to the man-king. Man is to be king over nature. Man is God's vice-regent on earth. As male and female, they would rule as one. The complementary way in which that looks, we will address later. Man is no evolutionary accident. He is dignified, powerful, purpose-driven. His status of bearing the image of God means it is precious, not another evolutionary step. God's royal representative means man's life is sacred. To murder a man would be to attempt to murder God. To purposely maim a man is to assault God. To mortally wound a man then requires the ultimate punishment. God began with blessing the couple and then provisions to populate, subdue and have dominion, and finally diet. On day 3, God created vegetation, which now corresponds to day 6, providing food. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food." Genesis 1 doesn't say that man cannot eat meat. God would soon kill animals. Their son would sacrifice sheep. But for now, they were to have a fruit and veg diet because death is a foreign concept. Animals too were given a vegetarian diet. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. God provides for and sustains his creation. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The pagan epics describe man providing mythical gods with food. Very different. In closing, and it was so. As if to sign off on his work, now man was created having inspected everything that he had made. God deemed his creation as very good. Not simply good, But the uniqueness of day 6 is emphasized in very good. The completion of all creation is perfect and in harmony. There is no sin, no disobedience from any of his created beings. Now, some idolize creation while others count the natural as evil. Both extremes contrary to the biblical worldview that sees God as the only one worthy of worship and his creation as originally good. Seeing his good work induces worship of the Creator. Creation bears witness even through the layers of evil. God's good creation demands good stewardship, void of exploitation and abuse. By looking at the original good state with special creation in Adam, the garden, blessing, commands, we can see the patterns and how it sets up God's dealings with Israel. Land, seed, blessing, themes of the Abrahamic covenant. God's original intention to bless all of humanity is seen in the covenant in Genesis 12, to multiply and bear good fruit. Very similar to Genesis 22, multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, right? To subdue and have dominion, right? Conquer and take possession of a promised land, and so forth. When we look at chapter 2, we'll see more of the resemblance between Adam and Israel. In terms of the broader purpose, it's not that God was lonely or required fellowship. Perfect love existed for eternity past within the Trinity. God created for his pleasure and for his glory. As a creative God, it gives him pleasure to create, and as a loving God, it gives him pleasure to extend his love beyond himself to us, enabling newly created beings to have a relationship with him. Thus, God created mankind, both male and female, in his own image to serve, glorify, worship, know and adore him. Far from unimportant, each of us are of profound significance in the eternal glorification of our Creator. Man has a sense of dignity as the culmination of God's infinite wisdom and skillful work of creation. Our purpose then is fulfilling the reason for being created, to glorify him. And in his presence there is fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore in Psalm 16. To know and delight in his character draws out extravagant rejoicing in him and him over us. His plan for an extended family of love, joy, peace, and perfection was off to a good start. Psalm 8, written by David, looks back to creation and man's role and purpose, and it begins and ends the same. O Lord our God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. This is man's purpose, to make his name majestic in all the earth. And actually, this psalm doesn't just look back to Adam, but points ultimately forwards to the second Adam, Messiah. In closing then of day 6, the structure is as follows. Part A of verse 26 is the announcement in the first person of God's intention. Part B of 26 is the purpose of man's creation to rule the earth. Verse 27, creation of man. Verse 28, the blessing on man to breed and rule the earth. Verse 29, the assignment of food to man, and 30, and to the animals. All of the 7 standard formulae are included. There are 4 divine speeches, twice as many as any other day, akin to twice as much manna on the 6th day for the Sabbath. Not simply good, but very good. The scriptures tell us that throughout the creative process there was rejoicing of the heavenly beings, and the Lord God rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of man. Which leaves us with one question. What language did they speak? What language did God speak to them? According to a Jewish tradition, this Adamic language was an early form of Hebrew because the names Eve and woman only make sense in Hebrew. Very possibly, the universal scope leaves us to wonder. Day 7. While chapter 1 covers the days of creation, the narrative flows into the seventh day, naturally ending at chapter 2, verse 3. Verse 1 begins, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." The narrator is kind of zooming out to cause a sense of awe and wonder of this fresh heavens and earth. Both heavens and earth have hosts. The phrase hosts of the earth, or host of the earth, doesn't appear in Scripture, but we know it refers primarily to mankind, right? We are the host of the earth. Whereas the host of heaven does appear elsewhere and refers to the angelic creatures. There is a debate over the meaning of verse 1. Some say it only refers to the men of the earth, others only the angels of heaven. I think both, right? It's a summary of the dwelling places, half the universe apart, and the creatures that fill them. Yes, the focus of chapter 1 is on the earth, and it is uninterested in angelology, but I think it's a kind of passing comment. We're not looking at that, but yes, at some point throughout the week, I created them also. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. When it says God finished the work, it's not that he continued his work into the seventh day, finishing it off. It's speaking of the previous day's work. While man was the climax of creation, day 7 is the climax of the high plateau of the creation week. There was silence before creation, and now on the seventh day of history, there is stillness and quiet in the universe. The powerful vibes of creation became calm. The thunderous noise ceased. The universe complete and perfect, readied to extend the glory of God. God rested from his work, which in Hebrew depicts a craftsman. It's not that God was in physical need to recover, but in a sense of ceasing from his skilled labor. Sana explains the form and the oneness of the week. The Sabbath, or divine cessation from creation, which to Torah is as much part of the cosmic order as the foregoing creativity. This day of quiet is to be sanctified. Once his skilled labor was complete, God blessed the seventh day and he made it holy. The days before he declared good or very good and blessed animal kinds and humankind, and now he blesses the seventh day. Following the pattern of purpose, the blessing is concerned with the expansion of life and the extension of God's glory. Life and the ministry of displaying God's glory across the globe is entirely dependent upon the blessing of God and not upon our days of work. Only this day is sanctified, made holy, which means to set apart. The character and the composition of explanation of day 7 is different. It is set apart. Wenham notes that the threefold mention of a seventh day, each time in a sentence of 7 Hebrew words, draws attention to the special character of the seventh day. The seventh day of resting is to be set apart from the 6 days of craftsmanship. Time itself is categorized as regular time and sacred time. The cosmos was created as a macro temple. We saw how he stretched out the heavens like a tabernacle. And consider too the temple language when God speaks to Job about the creation of the earth. And we've touched on these verses previously. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? The cosmos was made good, unstained, beautiful, with the earth set apart from all planets to reflect the heavenly glory. And now universal time is separated between the common and and the holy, a holy cyclic period from sundown Friday evening to sundown Saturday evening. Now, why is it special? Because God says so. It's part of his ordained order. Now, how can a day be holy? Well, God in essence is holy. To be declared holy means to be chosen by God for purpose. The seventh day is the first thing to be made or declared holy. How can a day be blessed? Well, we're familiar with individuals or people groups receiving blessing or the work thereof. But here we have a day with no work that is blessed. And Wenham says there is a suggestion that those who observe the Sabbath will enjoy divine blessing in their lives. The term Sabbath day is actually absent from this passage, as not to confuse this holy day with similar sounding pagan festivals. The Sabbath would become the only kind of ritual in the Ten Commandments. And as an explanation of the commandment to remember the Sabbath, the passage refers to the days of creation, calling the seventh day the first Sabbath. It says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." A primary reason then for creating in 6 regular days was to create the pattern for man's productivity, followed by rest on the seventh. God stopped to reflect on what he had made. He works redemptive history through this 7-day pattern, and immediate blessing signposts a future day of blessing. The Sabbath makes man reflect too and ask the biggest questions of life. Where have I come from? The Creator. Who am I? Made in the image of God. What is the purpose of my life? To glorify God. How should I live? And what is the product of the working days of my life? The Sabbath is not a reward for hard work. Our blessings are credited only to God. In stopping work, man is mirroring God and so affirming there is a Creator, the God of Israel. It is a reminder that we are not God and that our work always remains incomplete. It is a time of family refreshing, a reminder that we are creatures of not just space, but of time. It shifts us from production to presence. Our minds should project forward to the greater time of rest. Hebrews says, "So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his." It teaches Israel that he doesn't leave his work unfinished, and that those who he calls to salvation, he will deliver. And we will see later how the Sabbath is of more significance to the people of Israel. Jesus would go on to say the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, which means that Jesus, the Son of Man, is Lord even of the Sabbath. So then God began with creating time and finished with time. But are we required to keep the Sabbath? There is no apparent command for all to keep the Sabbath. There's no indication it was a weekly thing going forward. As stated, the Sabbath is not to be found, only the cognate verbal form Shabbat, meaning to desist from labour. I'm quoting scholars here. It is not used as a noun or a proper name for the seventh day until the Exodus, because only then is the command to keep the Sabbath actually given. The creation pattern sets up the institution for further revelation. We see in Exodus that 1 month before God institutes it at Sinai, it is already adhered to. In the Ten Commandments, remember to keep assumes that they already do. Now, Adam may have been given some instructions as an expression of God's law, but it wouldn't have necessarily included observing the Sabbath. There's no mention of keeping the Sabbath in the Adamic covenant in chapter 2. The seventh day The seventh day pattern would be a model for Israel to later follow rather than a creation ordinance required for all. Being familiar with the Sabbath, whether we keep it or not, is fundamental to one's worldview. Desisting from work on the Sabbath in recognition of God's declaration that it is holy means man imitating his Creator's pattern. My understanding is that those under the new covenant are not required to keep it. But not required doesn't mean that we shouldn't, and there's a good reason to do so, particularly if you are Jewish, which we'll look at when we come to the Exodus account. 6,000 years on, and the 7-day week is observed all around the world today, and the Jewish people, with those who join them, continue to rest each Sabbath. Throughout the scriptures, numbers find significance. In the creation account, 3, 7, and 10 are prominent. 3 speaks of who God is, 7 is the perfect number, and 10 speaks of wholeness and completion. The threefold mention of seventh day, 2 halves of the week. 3 occasions it states he created, 3 occasions he made, 3 occasions he blesses, 10 divine announcements God said, 10 mentions of kinds, and none more apparent than the number 7. The 7-day pattern echoes throughout the scriptures, and the number 7 being used hundreds of times, often representing divine perfection. Even in this section of Genesis alone, there are 7 paragraphs for 7 days, 7 acts of creation preceding the creation of humanity with a verbal expression, God said, let. God saw that his creation was good 7 times. Fulfillment, and it was so, 7 times. During the separation of waters on day 2 and 3, water is mentioned 7 times. 7 times either naming or blessing follows an act of creation. Light and day occurs 7 times in the first paragraph. The first verse is made up of 7 Hebrew words. The second verse is a multiple of the first with 14 Hebrew words, and there are more, and of course 7 days. Although there are 10 announcements of the divine words and 8 commands actually cited, all the formulae are grouped in 7s. 35 times God, Elohim, appears, 21 times the word earth, and so forth, all multiples of 7. God is underscoring the goodness, the wholeness, and the mathematical precision of the home he made for humanity. With literary beauty, concept, and motive, it puts to bed argument that suggests that Genesis was an accidental compilation recorded without supreme thought and insight or direct influence from the Creator. The formation of the heavenly lights, namely the sun and moon, along with the 7-day pattern, provide the basis for the Jubilee calendar, God's calendar, which is instituted through Moses. Throughout the scriptures, we will discover the use of 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 years, and 7 millennia. 7 weeks, 7 times 7 is the period between Passover and Shavuot, Pentecost. 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, again, is 49 plus the Jubilee year. If you add a year, thus the Jubilee calendar is made up of 50-year units. So the calendar is made up of blocks of 7s and 50s, or 5 lots of 10. As we will see, these 7 days of creation are not just musical and rhythmic beauty and mathematical prowess, they are also a prophetic timeline with the end of the age in sight. 6 days of working plus the 7th day of rest represents 6,000 years plus the millennial rest to come. Peter's second epistle and Hosea indicate this reality, and this was understood by the majority of the church fathers. I quote many of them if you're interested in my video, Count the Patience. In this way also he is declaring the end from the beginning. It's also why the last few chapters of Revelation have many parallels with the first few chapters of Genesis. Now, some commentators add that the activity within the creation days also corresponds somewhat to the 6 millennia as kind of defined dispensations of time. Light and separation from darkness on day 1 is connected with the first Adam living almost to the end of the first millennia. The separation of water on day 2 with Noah and the flood. The trees and fruit of day 3 with Exodus, Abraham and Torah. The 2 lights of day 4 with the first and second temple, the fish and birds of day 5 with destruction of the temple and nations dominating each other, man's creation of day 6 with the Messiah who will finally come at the end, and the earth will then receive rest on the 7th day. Now, the 7th day of rest fits perfectly. But it's difficult to nail down the other 6 for my liking. There may well be general connections, but I don't see dispensations of time. I'm not a dispensationalist. I think it speaks more descriptively of man's response to God, if anything, rather than God's kind of dealing differently with mankind. What's more, only the 7th day is set apart, which is consistent with the 2-age model of this age and the age to come, which is found throughout the scriptures. We will demonstrate in the next section that these creation days are ordinary days, and I'm going to include many quotes from contemporary scholars that are ranked as some of the best in their field on Genesis, and really show that the author's intent could only be understood as 24-hour days. Genesis wasn't written for modern scientists, right? It was to be understood by former slaves and children. It is a matter of scriptural authority. Let's conclude this section then. Traditional rabbinical insight, often ignored in a casual study, can be of interest. The Midrash informs us that the first letter of the Hebrew is Aleph and second Beth. God did not begin the Bible with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, why Aleph stands for Aror, the Hebrew for curse. Instead, he began it with Beth, which stands for Baraka, the Hebrew word for blessing. God began the creation, the Bible, with blessing. Unlike ancient creation epics, the biblical account of creation is apolitical, with, as Sana writes, no direct allusion to the people of Israel, Jerusalem, or the temple. It does not seek to validate national ideas or institutions. Moreover, it fulfills no cultic function. It is not attempting to prop up a pagan ancient dynasty or culture. It is universal in scope, lending credibility to the account. The style of Genesis 1 is beautifully written. I hope you'd appreciate that now. It's orderly, right? It's profound with symmetry. It's mathematical, and yet it's straightforward, universal, and a child can understand it. It says something about our God. Genesis 1 is not typical Hebrew poetry. It is not pure priestly theology, as some have suggested. There is no hymnic element in the language. It is not normal Hebrew prose either. It is a majestic literary composition, meticulously detailing the work of the Almighty God, setting up the chain of events that leads to the patriarchs and Exodus. We've spent a significant time on this first chapter and the following 3 verses, and if you're still with me, you've done well. But it's because the creation account is fundamental to the biblical worldview. Genesis 1 features as the first article of Christian creeds. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. We see the oneness of God, the plurality within the Godhead, the distinction of God creator from his creation. It speaks of his power and wisdom and wonder. God is without peer and competitor, sovereign and without resistance. He is creator, lawgiver, the cause of all. The goodness of creation reflects the creator. He commands into being, he speaks, and nature obeys. He acts, executes, lovingly molds and sustains. He fulfills what he has said. He examines and approves good. He names and he blesses. He created, defines and marks time. Man is set apart, ordered, tasked, given covenant, companionship, responsibility, rest. Man can fellowship, obey, be a blessing. Israel would know who they worship and all those who seek to know him, the creator of heavens and earth. What separation his blessing, his word, his approval, his naming, and so forth looks like, what it means. It refutes all other worldviews and makes men stand in fear. Psalm 33 says, "Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood firm." Our response is fear and awe. Isaiah 42 is home to such a stunning summary of creation in one verse. "Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk in it." Stretched vertically, spread horizontally, blessed invasively with spirit. Now, before we move the story into the garden, next time we will show how the creation days are the antithesis of evolution. May God bless you and may you be fruitful and multiply. See you next time.